Hello, everybody. My name is Polly Mackenzie, and I'm the Chief Executive of Demos. Welcome to this, I think technically it's a Zoom webinar, though it's also streaming live on YouTube, which is the first time we have tried that technology. It takes a few moments for participants to tick through. So I'm not going to introduce John quite yet, but I will just hang on whilst the numbers tick upwards. Demos, let me just tell you a little bit about Demos in case you don't know us. We are a cross-party think tank that are obsessed with ways to bridge divides, and including by bringing people, citizens, into the policy-making process and build relationships between citizens and also between citizens and the politicians who serve them. And that's why I was so delighted when John reached out to me and said, hey, I've written this book about bridging divides and healing divisions. And, you know, would you like to chat about it as part of John's work to promote that fantastic book? So if you haven't bought it, do. It's called Fractured, and John is going to tell you about it in a moment. But first of all, let me just introduce John. So John, we've just been discussing the complexities. John was one of the people who founded National Citizenship Service, which is something that I was really thrilled to be involved in when I served in government in the coalition years. I think it's one of the strongest and most brilliant lasting legacies of everything that we did in those years, some of which is much more controversial. But National Citizen Service is an extraordinary legacy and a wonderful program, which I think we should all be grateful to John for. John now runs a What Works Centre around how we can change lives of young people and tackle all of the challenges that young people face in growing into adulthood, which is the Youth Endowment Fund. And he is also a member of the Conservative Party and the son of a vicar. And we will find out more about John. But first, I'm going to ask him to tell us about the book Fractured and what it suggests we ought to be doing about the problems that our country, and I think lots of other countries, face at the moment. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Polly. Look, it's an absolute honour to be here. I've long been a huge fan of Demos's, and a fan of all the work Polly has done in government and now out of it. The core argument of this book, Fractured, the core argument of it is that the average English person, the average British person, the average American, the average Scot and Welsh and Northern Irish person too, is right about something. Half of British people say that their country has never felt so divided. 80% of Americans say that their country is mainly or entirely divided, and I think they're onto something. And I think we can see it most clearly in our friendship groups. So half of those of us with degrees, half of graduates, have no friends who don't have a degree. The vast majority of pensioners don't have contact with anyone under the age of 35, unless it's their grandchildren. A fifth of those who voted to leave, a quarter of those who voted to remain, don't have any friends who voted the other way. Half of us have no friends from a different ethnic group. And the biggest divide of all in this country remains class. So a UK barrister here in London would have to invite 100 people into their garden, so 3 times the legal limit, before they would invite a single person who is unemployed. And I also think we've quite badly misdiagnosed why we are so divided. And again, the average person, I think, has a much better handle on it than those of us who are writing columns or writing books. My experience of talking to most people about division is that eventually somebody will say, yes, but John, hang on, hasn't it always been this way? And actually, while we're at it, birds of a feather flock together. And the truth is, they're right. And there's been now 39,000 academic studies that have all come to the same core conclusion, that all of us have a slight but constant bias towards people who remind us of ourselves. There's an amazing example of two schools in Oldham that were entirely, one of them, Counter was entirely white British children, and one of them, Breezehill, was entirely Asian British pupils. And they were merged together to form a new school, Waterhead Academy. And sociologists decided to track who the kids sat next to at the lunch hall. And they found that the white British and the Asian British kids didn't sit next to each other very often. They could choose wherever they chose to sit, and they didn't choose to sit next to each other very often. That's not that surprising. Marvellous, a cat. That's not that surprising. Not at all. That's not that surprising.
See, and he's even a different species from me. So I'm creating a metaphorical performance.
You're nailing it. You're nailing it, Polly. That's not very surprising, though, because the children were educated in completely different schools. But the sociologists also tracked what the hair colour was of the children and whether they wore glasses or not. And they found that children with ginger hair were more likely to sit next to other kids with ginger hair, and children with glasses were more likely to sit next to kids with glasses. We just have this slight bias. And it's been found from Kuala Lumpur to Kingston. It affects who we choose to work with, who we do academic studies with, who we sit next to in the lunch hall, who we go to work with, and who we're friends with. But it doesn't by itself, this bias, which I call people like me syndrome, this sort of people like me syndrome, this bias, doesn't by itself explain why we're divided, because it's a constant. So it can't explain why we're more divided now any more than if you said, why is it so sunny? Why was it so sunny yesterday but less sunny now? And I said, the sun. The sun doesn't explain a change in the weather. It is part of the explanation, but it doesn't explain the change. So what's changed? And to get a great handle on that, I think we need to cast our eyes to northern Tanzania. There's a tribe in northern Tanzania called the Hadza, who are really unusual group of people. There's 400 of them, and they've lived there for 60,000 years.
Same people.
And the ancestors of their forefathers. Okay. And what's striking about them is they're hunter-gatherers. So in the modern era, they gather food rather than plant it. And the other thing that's intriguing about them is once a month they perform something called the apem. Now the apem is a dance, and what happens is on a night when the moon is completely gone, everyone gathers in the dark. The men go and hide, normally behind some trees or something similar. They one by one they'll come out wearing an ostrich headdress, holding a rattle, bells around one ankle, and a cape on their back. And they start off leading a dance, and then the women join in and the children, and this can last for 2 or 3 hours. But what's fascinating about the apem is it seems completely pointless. So it doesn't resolve disputes. It doesn't sort out any sort of hierarchy. It's not part of some religious story that the Hadza believe. So what on earth is the point of it? And again, a group of this time anthropologists decided to follow the Hadza. And they followed them for a decade. And they tracked, who do the Hadza share tools with? Who do they bed down with for the night? Who do they gossip with? So basically, who do the Hadza trust? And they found that, first of all, they tend to trust people they're really closely related to. So you've got 400 Hadza, but in small family units. And so first of all, they found people like me syndrome, people biased towards the people close-knit to them. The second thing they found, though, is there's another group the Hadza tend to trust, and that's the people they dance the apem with. And what the anthropologists find is they actually are more likely to trust the people they dance the apem with than the people they're closely related to. So what the apem is doing, to use our modern language, is making diversity work. The Hadza are in diverse, different families, but they are connected by this, what I call common life, this institution that bonds people together, people that they didn't choose to spend time with. When we choose, we have a bias. When we don't choose, we connect well, actually, with almost anybody. Now, when you start looking, you can find these common life institutions throughout human history. You can find them when we were agrarians. We tend to stop dancing those sort of dances, but we turn to feast days. We turn to rites of passage. We turn to more organised religious services. When we moved to the cities, those tended to wither away, but we had a huge upspring of clubs and societies. We saw the birth of mandatory schooling, and we saw the arrival of the workplace. And people didn't choose too much where they sent their children to school. They didn't choose where they worked. We found these institutions, again, mixing us with people we didn't choose to connect with. So why are we dividing? The reason we're dividing is because that common life that connected our grandparents and our great-grandparents together has been declining. So every generation since 1950, less likely to join a club and a society. We still send our children to school outside of a pandemic. We still tend to go to work when we can outside of a pandemic, but we expect to choose. Most of us choose what schools we send our children to, and most of us obviously choose where we work. And so people like me syndrome comes in. Now that's a problem, and I won't go into this, but the book sort of lays out the impact of those extreme, when the divisions get too great, on social mobility, on our democracy, on levels of anxiety, on even the economy, and also on security when we think about extremism. The question really is, why is it happening? And therefore, how do we fix it? And so just to nail that off, and then I'll come to a close. So I think, again, we've misdiagnosed the reasons for our divisions very poorly. So we've got to understand, why is the common life declining? And there's really, the good news is, I can identify for you two villains of the piece. The bad news is there are two things we really like. So the first one is choice. I like to choose. Most of us like to choose. We didn't like to be forced to be here today. We chose whether to come. I like to choose the school I send my children to. I think choice actually drives up school standards. But when we have choice, people like me syndrome flows in, and therefore it allows division to happen. So the first villain is, again, something we like, it's choice. But hang on a moment, because one of the things that connected us together, our grandparents and great-grandparents, were clubs and societies. No one was forced to join a club and society, though I was once forced to join the Scouts for a while, but mainly people are not forced. The Hads are not forced to join the PEM. They choose to. A bit of pressure, but they do choose to. The feast days, again, when you weren't forced to join a feast day. So why were these so popular? And the answer is, they were just unbelievably perfectly designed for the moment. So it made sense to the Hadza, and it does today, to dance in the night because they're out anyway. But those rituals all died away in villages. Didn't fit. Feast days, villagers spent, an English villager in the 15th century spent 1 in 5 days in a feast day. It fitted with the way their life worked, but it didn't fit when we moved to the city. Ditto clubs and societies. And the trouble is, what causes the problem is our societies change, and businesses adapt, but voluntary institutions don't. They don't rapidly change. They don't adapt. They just slowly wither away. And so the two villains are choice and change. And we have seen a colossal amount of change over the last 70 years. Very happy to talk more about that. So what do we do? What's the solution? Well, I think we've got 3 fundamental options. The first is to do absolutely nothing. Don't try and create a new common life, just accept it and wait for some new common life at some point, maybe something digital to spring up that's so brilliant that we want to be part of it, and we connect again. It's a totally valid option. Last time, common life turned up last time when they got disrupted. It did take 1,000 years for the agrarian common life to turn up, but it took 100 years for the city-based industrial one. But it will eventually arrive, I believe. But we should just get used to waiting and stop complaining about our divisions. The second option is to slow down the rate of change. If it's change that disrupts the voluntary common life, slow it down and let it adapt. And there are countries that have done this. Effectively, the Nordic countries have taken this approach. I don't think they've done it on purpose, but by providing protection to the impact of economic change, by having lower levels of movement of people, lower levels of immigration, and actually their values haven't changed so much during the last 75 years. Their clubs and societies, actually the membership has stayed quite high, and clubs have adapted to fit the small adjustment in the society. I just don't think this is a terribly credible option. We've got so much change, I think, coming down the line over the next 50 years through technology that I don't think we could keep tapping at the brakes, even if we wanted to. So what's the final option? Well, the Nordics, just to touch on them, when you rank all the rich countries in the world and how much people trust each other and take responsibility for each other, they come first, second, third, and fifth, because the common life still connects them. But what about the country that comes fourth? Well, the country that comes fourth has taken a completely different route, very open to change. Their economy is constantly being transformed, very open to immigration. 40% of the people who live there were born in a different country. And this is Singapore. Now, Singapore's approach has been to be hugely open to change, but to do something about choice. It said, actually, we're going to have moments in citizens' lives where they have to spend time with people they don't choose to spend time with. They've used it in the way they approach their schooling. They've used it in the way that they've maintained national service. And they've even done it with their housing. 80% of housing in Singapore is publicly owned. Now, I don't think we can copy and paste what Singapore has done. I don't think that would be appropriate. But I think we should consider a Western version of the Singaporean model. Now, you might immediately think, oh, it sounds like some sort of terrible fascism. What do I mean? I mean that we might say that children have to, by law, spend 100 months in education. maybe they could spend one of those months doing community activity with children from all sorts of different schools, including private schools. We might say, look, most of us, not all of us, but many of us will start a family at some time. I think we should be more generous when it comes to childcare. But in return, we might say that parents have to come along to a number of sessions to learn how their child's brain works and how it will develop, and do that with parents from across town. Most of us will retire. We will have a third of our life still to live. And it's hugely valuable to keep those people involved in society. Of course it is. So why not continue to be generous for pensions, but to say that when you retire, you need to get involved in a number of sessions locally to see how you might get involved in your local community if you want to. And also meet some people who have also recently retired from across your town who you didn't choose to spend time with. 3 new institutions that could knit our society together. And to close, I think a view people may have is, look, John, you've laid out this idea of a mandatory common life to connect us. And that's all very nice, but it's completely inconceivable. And I think what I'd say in response to that is, first of all, maybe it is, but what's the alternative? I think we've been treating the issue of division not at all seriously. And we've suggested that the best policy response is some nice street parties for the Queen's birthdays and some discussion about British values. It's like bringing warm words to a gunfight. And finally, actually, when we look at all the significant changes that have happened in British society through our politics, don't all of them start off as inconceivable? Whether we're looking at the introduction of the NHS, to the introduction of the welfare state, to joining the EU, to leaving the EU, they all began as inconceivable until they became imaginable, until they became plausible, until they became likely, until they became unavoidable. And in writing this book, I hope to start the journey of the idea of a mandatory common life from being inconceivable to being unavoidable.
Thanks so much, John. So you're trying to start a movement. Was that the driving force? You know, what, I don't know how long it took you to write this book. How long did it take to write a book? 1,000 hours?
Yeah. I mean, it took me 6 years. I started 6 years ago. So I'm clearly very slow.
It should have been the great American novel. I mean, you know.
It's really a letdown when you consider 6 years of effort.
So 6 years, 1,000 hours. Like why did you start typing? Like what's the trigger?
Yeah, so I part of it was a sense of meeting people to whom these divisions have a negative impact. I was struck by a boy I got to know through the National Citizen Service, Dami, who at the end of the programme, so you know the children spend time with 11 other children doing quite intense activities, people they don't know. And I said to Dami, you know, what's the impact of the programme been on you? And he said, I'm going to go to university. And I was like, okay, great. Okay, were you not planning to? No, I just never thought of it. I was going, what's changed your mind? Well, the thing is, I've met Billy. Billy assumes he's going to university. Billy's stupid. And I was struck by, I mean, it's a slightly sort of tongue-in-cheek story, but it's a true story. And I was struck by, you know, Dami's lack of connections and experiences hadn't opened the world to him. You know, I was talking to someone the other day who had applied for 65 internships and been, done well at school, done well at university, doing well at university, needed a sandwich year, applied for 65 internships, got turned down for all of them. And then his friends were constantly doing it through networks and finding something. And he went on a mentoring program, met someone, got a link and got the role. And I was struck, and the boy I was talking to, Tolu, you know, Black African heritage boy, on average, doing better at school than white kids. But when it comes to the jobs market, it doesn't follow through because they don't have the networks, they don't have the connections. So there was sort of, I kept finding these experiences. But I was also just struck, you know, personally, you know, I have a career that's moved me. I started off as a very quickly failed stand-up comedian. I ended up as a community worker in Newham in East London. I then found myself accidentally at Mackenzie and Company when I clicked on the wrong button on a website when applying. But long story short, I found myself moving from one bubble to another bubble. And people just didn't seem to have an understanding of each other's lives at all. Mackenzie was this incredibly diverse international place, but no one knew anyone who was poor. And yet, how could we? And I found myself in these conversations about problems in our country. And I thought, we don't really understand our own country because we have no contact with each other. And this sort of frustration I felt that we have so much energy, so many of us have drive to improve things, but we don't even understand what's going on because we're so disconnected from one another. And I kept on sort of wrestling that ultimately you've just got to bring people together. And in the meantime, from the time I started writing to the end. When I started, Brexit was a typo. And the worst thing Donald Trump had done was a bad cameo in Home Alone 2. The world changed while I was writing, and suddenly everyone was worried about the problem.
I think his bad cameo in The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air is worse, personally, but that's probably a different event. So it's really interesting because, I instinctively find myself agreeing with lots of what you say, but the question of social mobility is one where it doesn't, if I think to, the existence of a common life where one might sit in the church pew every Sunday with people from all sorts of backgrounds, but just who happen to kind of share a geographical location with you in the 50s or the 1910s or wherever it might be, that's not a socially mobile world. I wonder whether is this idea of reconnection and understanding, is that a pathway to more mobility, or do we just need different solutions to that?
I think it really is a pathway to mobility. I mean, look, I really don't want to turn the clock back to 1950. I mean, to be completely straightforward, 1950 was not a good time for those of us who are ethnic minorities. It was not a great time for many women. There's a lot of things wrong with the 1950s. What I want to do is get ahead. I want to get on to the next cycle of bringing people together. Wherever the next thing is, I want to get there fast. But on connection, there's this fantastic piece of work that was done in the US where a guy called Raj Chetty divided the country up into about 800 different parcels of geography, and he got the tax records of everyone born between 1980 and 1982 in the entire country. And what he tracked social mobility of all Americans, basically using their tax records, and then he worked out which are the places in the country that have the highest social mobility, and he ranked a number of factors that could be driving it, and he wrote down on the board things he could consider. So, do you have to pay to go to university? How much? What's the local unemployment? What's the local employment rate? Is there a manufacturing available? How much money is spent on schools? And then he added, to what extent do people connect with each other across ethnic and income lines? That last thing he wrote down was more impactful than all the other four. Now, and one of those things was the amount of money spent on schools. Now, if the most authoritative piece of work on social mobility concludes that a lack of networks and connections, because he actually split two things that were both more powerful. One was segregation by income and race. The other was social capital. So we found the same result basically twice. And in both cases, it was more impactful than the amount of money being spent on schools. Now, I worked as a special advisor in the Department for Education. I've argued with the Treasury for more money to be spent on schools. I am in favour of investment in education. But we have to follow the evidence. I mean, the evidence is the connections and the networks actually are more impactful than the money. And yet, how many conversations were either of us ever in talking about social mobility where someone really seriously, not just as a nice conversational point, seriously said, I'll put together a plan, by the way, to do something about networks and connections. It never happened in any meeting I was ever in, apart from me doing it and everyone looking at me like I was a bit mad.
It's interesting, though, because the conversation about social mobility, I think, has moved on as part of this, a shift towards leveling up, the leveling up agenda, this question of somewheres versus anywheres, a recognition that for lots of places, a social mobility narrative was about taking the top 10% and saving them from growing up from, whatever it might be, Burnley or Bilth Wells, where I did my A-levels, the sort of sense that you could get out and you could go somewhere else and come to London and be a High Court judge. And that was a story of social mobility. And what we've realised is that it's sort of intellectual asset stripping process for places that quite reasonably felt left behind and angry about that. And so I guess the challenge is, even talking about social mobility now has become a difficult thing. People want to think about, and I think the Prime Minister has said specifically, he wants people to be able to get a great job where they are and not have to leave to find prosperity and opportunity. And obviously that then ties in much better to connectedness and rootedness and a sense that this is who I am and this is where I'm from and this is where I will stay. And I think that does appeal to lots and lots of people. there's also the possibility that it closes down options. Like in London, it's very easy to be connected to people who are very poor whilst being rich. It's not easy, it doesn't happen as much as it should, but you can have, I don't know, Battersea, where you've got, extraordinary £10 million houses, and then right on Prince of Wales Drive, and then right behind them, you've got the Doddington and Rollo estate of, full of people, incredible poverty. You can bring those people together and they've both still got opportunity. You go back to Builth Wells, where I'm from, there's jobs in agriculture and there's jobs in tourism. So what I guess stitching together mobility with actual non-geographic mobility becomes much more difficult, doesn't it?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, there's a reason why I spent 10 years of my life founding what we call a social integration charity rather than a social mobility charity. I am more passionate about doing something about connection than I am about nailing us winning the social mobility awards, because I do think social mobility, it's like everything. I like broccoli, but if you just give me broccoli all the time, I don't want that meal. I like social mobility, but if we nail social mobility and think that makes us great society, I don't think it does. I think perfectly social mobile society is one when people go up as well as down.
Down as well as up.
Right. And I don't think we're ready. I don't think we like that idea at all. We sort of like the idea that people should go up, but no one should go down. And I'm from Plymouth.
People should definitely go down.
I grew up in Plymouth. And, so many of my friends left, got degrees. I mean, we were anywheres out of somewheres. And I think that is, I don't think that makes a good society. And I think, the collecting together of people in cities, in order to do professional, well-paid jobs, which simplifies it a bit, but is kind of what's been happening, I think is very damaging for our democracy, because I think what we end up with is increasing numbers of people who are highly educated, with a network of friends who all have degrees, who all have very similar experiences in life, and don't really understand the other side of the country, and the other way around. And if that's right, what we would see in both the US and the UK is voting being increasingly driven by whether you're in cities or whether you're rural. And we should see a realignment of the political parties, which is obviously exactly what we're seeing. And if it's true that I'm saying it's not just a reallocation, it's the division, we should see increasingly lack of understanding across that divide, which politicians feel the need to take advantage of. So we should see growing culture wars, which is exactly what we see. And the problem with the culture war isn't the war. I mean, some of these things we do need to have arguments over. I sort of don't agree that, we should never have debates about these things. We do need to have debates about these things. The problem is that they're the only things sometimes that we seem to be spending energy on. We have so many fundamental problems in our country that we should be fixing. But we don't really, you mentioned how it's easy to live in London around the rich and the poor. It is, but exactly as you said, it's very easy to live in London and have no contact or networks with any of those people who are different from yourself. And therefore, how do you actually build a political movement, a consensus to actually change some of the problems that really matter, whether the lack of investment in technical education, which those of us who went to university don't really think about, or the issues about social care, or the fact that we constantly are undercutting the children's social care budget, but don't really worry about it because it's not really our children or people like us. These problems are very hard to solve in a divided society.
So we've had a question from Damien Atkinson. Thank you, Damien. If anybody else has got questions, just put them in the chat, in the Q&A box, and I will pass them on to John, probably crowbarring an opinion of mine here and there. So Damien's question is around the COVID pandemic and the impacts of that. Because, of course, lots of us have become more connected. At Demos, we did this big engagement exercise with about 50,000 people called Renew Normal, People's Commission on Life After COVID, to try and identify, what were the few silver linings of this experience that we ought to be finding policy solutions to cling to. And basically there were only two: that sense of connected community and reconnecting with family. So I think Damien's right that there has been this real tidal wave of change in our connectedness. Is that something we should build on? How do we do that? Or is it because we also know there's huge amounts of evidence around just economic pulling away. Again, just to quote some more Demos research. So we've mapped out the impact of remote working. And what you've got is a situation whereby higher income people more likely to be able to work remotely and therefore spend money locally during the day. And so richer high streets have got pulling together of more people spending more money, poor high streets, people who are more likely to be commuting and so not spending money locally, and they haven't got as much money to spend locally anyway. So poorer high streets collapsing whilst artisanal bakeries on our rich high streets divide. So better or worse, and what do we do about it?
Yeah, so I think it's too early to say. I mean, I think there are clear elements that are positive and clear elements that are negative. I mean, fundamentally, the pandemic has forced us to spend much more time just with our close family or people we live with. You know, I've once described it as we've basically been overdosing on whatever our normal life is. So obviously on one level, we're not mixing and connecting because we've been locked indoors a lot of the time. Now, some positive elements though. So, the basic diagnosis I'm giving of division is that you've got people like me syndrome on the one hand, pulling you, whenever you've got choice, pulling you towards people like you. And then common life institutions, things you join because you kind of want to join or you're forced to join, where you connect to people you didn't choose. Now, those little WhatsApp groups locally are quite good common life things because people join them not because of who's in them. They don't go, oh, she's in, he's in, I like them, I'll join. They sort of join because, oh, it's my street, I'll join. Now, there is an issue that our streets are a little bit full of people like us, but they're not all. And so these WhatsApp groups are quite good way of building connection across some of the lines of difference. So I think there's a positive there. I think the fact that people could potentially continue to work from home or work more days from home provides an opportunity for us to sort of pull away from the fact that knowledge workers increasingly have been centralized into certain cities. And so we could see people starting to spread back out again, which is a positive, because as I say, I want these common life institutions to bring people together locally. But if everyone who lives locally is the same, it doesn't really work. So that's a positive. I think the case for the negative, though, is that, as I said, these voluntary institutions we build up, the connectors, get really disrupted by change. Like lots of us will have connections or groups or clubs or things we're members of that were linked to where we went to work, either because they're part of our workplace or that it's a gym near where we work or something we went to on the way home. That's obviously been disrupted by us being based at home. And these things tend not to work so well online. So there's reasons to be optimistic. I think it's pretty neutral. What it has done, though, is I think it's created a bit of a sort of, at least a window into what sort of society do we want to build. Now, that will close pretty fast. But I think there is a space to say, well, hang on a second, levelling up. Why don't we do more to try and get knowledge workers to be based around the country? You know, there are little things we should be able to try and do, which would help. But I think it's broadly neutral.
So Philip Thomas has asked a question which sounds like a sort of Viva question to test you on your footnotes. Do you
Gordon Allport?
Yeah. Are you updating Gordon Allport's contact hypothesis?
Yeah, I basically,
first of all, can you explain Gordon Allport's contact hypothesis?
I basically am a disciple of Gordon Allport, so I've been outed. Allport tells this. Let me do it with a story and then explain it. So, in 1944, at the sort of near end of the Second World War, the Allies have invaded Europe, and they've come.
Don't use the historical present. Like, it's not in our time. It's in the past. It happened. I think you should use the past tense. And I'm willing to go to the mattresses in this one. I can't stand the historical present. It just really grates. So the Allies, whatever they did it.
Well, I'm going to struggle to constantly put this in the past. So you
okay, well, try for my sake.
You might have to translate in your own head. Okay, the Allies had invaded.
Yes. Yeah. Great work.
They have. See, I'm back again. They've taken.
You're just auditioning for Melvin Bragg's job. Fine.
They've taken most of France, but the supply line is hugely stretched, but Hitler's hugely outnumbered, and typically Hitler decides to roll the dice phenomenally and takes a huge risk, and he calls up roughly 406,000 men and throws them into an attack on the stretched supply line, and completely against the advice of his generals. And Eisenhower, in charge of the Allied forces, completely caught off guard and doesn't see it see it coming. This is known as the Battle of the Bulge. And there's this huge attack, so catches the Allies off guard that for a while they can't work out what to do about it. And Eisenhower is desperately trying to call more men to the front to fight. And he says to his generals, come on, there must be people we haven't called up to fight. Where are they? Who are they? And eventually they realize that there are a number of battalions that haven't been called to the front. And Eisenhower can't believe it. And he insists that they are deployed. And the reason they haven't been deployed is they're black. And the US Army is segregated in the same way that the southern states were segregated. And so the men are not meant to be deployed fighting at the front line. And Eisenhower waived the rule and said, this is ridiculous, and asked for volunteers. And 2,000 black servicemen volunteered to be embedded with white battalions and go to fight. Now, what happened 2 years later is the US, after the war was won, the US Army decided to move towards desegregating the entire armed forces. And they surveyed white servicemen, generally, how they felt about desegregation. And 70% of them were opposed. They thought it was a very bad idea and would ruin their ability to fight. But they separately surveyed the men who had been fighting in those battalions in the Battle of the Bulge. And they found that those white servicemen, 7% of those were opposed. And Allport used this as his sort of main example of what he called contact theory. And the idea was what happened to those white servicemen wasn't that they were given a talk or lectured or explained or anything like that. They had a shared experience, which had some important things about it. So firstly, there was an equality of status between those men. So they were wearing the same uniform, they were fighting in the same trenches, they were doing the same stuff. Secondly, there was an intensity to that experience. They were fearful for their lives. And thirdly, there was routine. They were marching, cleaning their guns. And so the core evidence really is that we don't solve these problems of division by national stories. They can help, but they're not the core of what you need. What you need is to bring people together with people you don't choose to spend time with, who are different from you, equal status, either an intense experience or routine. And so that's at the heart really of the book, that so Gordon Allport is the guy who first coined the phrase. I don't use the phrase contact theory because I try to keep the thing very non-academic, but that is the heart of the book.
Fantastic, thank you. I think that comes then to the question which has come from Tom Griffiths. And let me tell you a story. So where I live in Camberwell at the moment, and I live right next door to something called the Trinity Centre, and just, I don't know, a few hundred yards from Cambridge House, and perhaps a mile away from a place sort of known as the Pekka Experiment, all of which were outshoots of basically early sociology in the early part of the 20th century, of Cambridge people coming to Peckham and Camberwell to study poor people, a bit like the mass observation movement. And so the Peckham Experiment was, they built, this is I think then from the style of the building, the 30s, they built a sort of amazing set of houses with some allotments and a swimming pool to try and see if you put poor people into really great housing facilities, would they just live better lives? To try and see, it's great. I'm not sure it would always get as easily past an ethics committee now, but to sort of see, is it the terrible conditions that are making people live, struggling lives, or is it something that's wrong with them? So it's sort of very well-meaning to try and see can you help people to live more fulfilled, more, to educate their kids better, to feed their kids better, if you take them out of their conditions and put them somewhere close by. But that's amazing. And Cambridge House, again, is a legacy of people who would come down from Trinity College every summer to just study poor people. And Tom's question reminded me of all of that, because it's well-paid professionals investigating poor or complicated families that somehow intensifies division because it creates stereotypes, denigrating narratives. In a way, what you're saying is that contact that's hierarchical in that way, the studier and the studied, isn't what we need. What we need is something that's more egalitarian.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think we also need to, it needs to be less about words and less about study. So I think the trouble is those of us who tend to talk about the issue of division and say that we and cared about it, but want to talk about it, tend to have our own biases. And so one of them is that we think that the way to solve problems is to talk about them. And if everyone gets together and just talks about the problem, that will help. And we also tend to think that people are interested in politics when most people are not. And so we tend to think what we need to do is bring people together in groups to be part of a movement, or to lobby for something, or to be a campaign group, or to discuss how they will spend local council taxes. All of those things I perfectly am in favour of, but I think it's a sort of nuts way of tying one hand behind your back to solve this problem. Like, bring people together to do things together that they enjoy doing, that they want to do, or that are very useful to them. As long as they have equality, as long as you can find a way to get towards an equality of status, and you can have something intense or something routine, it doesn't need to be worthy. I mean, why when we designed National Citizen Service, and thank you for your very kind words about it, but when we designed National Citizen Service, one of the reasons why we were so keen to take everyone hiking and doing outdoor stuff in the first week was, firstly, you probably
fills me with horror.
Right.
Horror.
Firstly,
honestly, Duke of Edinburgh.
Firstly, you probably don't wear your smartest.
Blisters.
You probably don't wear your smartest, best clothes to go and do that. And so there's a certain level of evening up that's like, some people will, but there's some degree of evening up that's going to happen. On a lot of those places, the places people went, they actually gave them sort of boiler suits, things to put on. So you've immediately removing some of the telltale signs we've got of you're higher class than I am, you're better off than I am. But you're also, ideally, this won't work for every child, but you're getting people into a place where no one's been here before. It's neutral ground, and we're doing things that none of us have done before, ideally. So we're all in the same sort of boat. And I think we sort of understate the importance of that, and how we sometimes think, people can feel comfortable with our norms and our way of doing things. And sometimes it can be tricky. But this is why sport can be so effective. Anything that's intense, but also anything that's routine. There's a great, I talk about in this book, there's a great example of these children who are just stringing beads. I mean, you can't think of anything less intense than stringing beads onto it to make a necklace. And there's one group that they meet for an hour, and one group just randomly strings the beads on however they want, and they chat. And the other group has to follow a routine. They have to pick up the heart one, touch their forehead, put it on the string, pick up a star one, clap once, put it on the string. This mad sort of routine is created. And at the end, they ask the children whether they'd like to stay in their group, which group they think is better, and so on. And they find the guys who've done the routine have become incredibly loyal to their group. And the guys who've actually been chatting, probably getting to know each other, are kind of, yeah, it's okay. There's something weird about human psychology. That's why armies march. It's not because it's an efficient way to get anywhere. It's because the routine creates a sense of connection. So we do need to use some of these sort of quirks to our advantage.
How do we get over the quirks that aren't to our advantage? You've called it people like us syndrome. There's probably, maybe you can introduce us to it. There's probably an academic name for it as well. We just have this really strong tendency and preference, and you have to fight sort of the gravitational energy of that so hard. And in a world with digital technology that can connect us to even the most small groups of people who happen to be like us all around the world, and in which artificial intelligence is building, algorithmic, personalized shopping experiences, media experiences for us, where we are so enabled in our choice. Is it really possible to build something that's got enough competing energy to actually counteract that what you acknowledge is an extraordinary neurobiological pull factor towards people who aren't like us?
Yeah. So the academic term is homophily.
Love it.
But I always refer to people like me syndrome. But the good news is that the bad news is I don't think you can get rid of the bias. And I think we just have. It's not like the biggest bias in the world, but it is a pretty constant bias towards people who remind us of ourselves. I don't think you can get rid of that. It would seem to be evolved into us. But you can adjust who is perceived to be like me. So there's this brilliant piece of work that a guy called Mark Levine and a guy called Stephen Riker did, where they got together a group of volunteers who were all Manchester United fans. And they called them forward one by one. And the Man United fan comes forward, and the researcher says, okay, I understand you're a Man United fan. Who's your favourite Manchester United player? What's the best Manchester United game you've ever played? And what is it you love about supporting Manchester United? Thank you very much. And then the volunteers asked to go walk about 300 yards over there to the room where the experiment will really happen. Now, whenever an experiment person says where it will really happen, you know it's not really where it will happen. And as the person is walking over, the experiment actually takes place. And what happens is someone comes running past and trips up. And a third of the time, the person who trips up is wearing a Manchester United top. And a third of the time, they're wearing a Liverpool top, which are sort of arch enemies of Man United. And a third of the time, they're just wearing a red top, same colour as the other two. And what they find in this experiment, unsurprisingly, is that the volunteer is significantly more likely to help the person wearing the Manchester United top, biased towards people like me. But they ran the experiment again, and again, Manchester United volunteers, different people, but still Man United fans as volunteers, and they asked them slightly different questions up front. They say, we understand you're a football fan. Who is your favourite football player? What's the best football game you've ever seen? What do you like about being a football fan? And then they do the same thing again, walking across a third Man United, people falling over, a third Liverpool, a third red top. What they find is the person is just as unlikely to help the person with the red top on. They don't care. But then now, they still are hugely more likely to help the Man United top person, but they're also hugely more likely to help the Liverpool person. So actually our perception of who is like us can be adjusted. And the main way to adjust it isn't in framing. It's through these shared intense experiences. I built a very deep friendship through being on it, doing some overseas activity with a friend of mine, Jawad Aslam. Jawad's a very devout Sunni Muslim. I was brought up a Christian and still am a Christian. Like, Jawad didn't convince me to be a Muslim. I didn't convince him to be a Christian. But we found ourselves going through things together and built a shared identity as people of faith. That wasn't because I went on an RE class. That was because we did stuff together. And so my perception of who is like me shifted because of that experience with Jawad. And it's this is great news. We actually can form connections, and it doesn't remove our previous identity, but it stretches it a bit. And that's what we miss out on when we live in our little bubbles. And that's why societies have always come up with these common lives, because it just creates more overlaps and makes everything safer.
Yeah. And in the absence of them, we default to the simplistic
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
If it's a race and income and cultural signifiers.
Absolutely.
So we've had another couple of questions from Ed Hillier around it's hard to credit other people's opinions because 49% versus 51% is essentially an even split, especially within the margin of error. And that leaves a great many of us feeling effectively disenfranchised. And he asks whether a divided society, in fact, suits politicians. I think a divided society certainly suits the Russians. So we've done at Demos a lot of work studying disinformation and the way it is propagated and amplified by state and non-state actors. And it's really interesting that we have some machine learning software that we deploy to analyze large-scale natural language data sets. And so Twitter released a data set of 9 million tweets by bots that were linked to the Internet Research Agency. And you might assume that there's a propagandist message that they're trying to communicate something. And what's fascinating is that the tactics of that disinformation warfare is not about propagating a narrative. It's about propagating multiple and conflicting narratives. So division absolutely is what is being pushed by what you might term our enemies, or certainly countries that have competing interests with ours. Are you as cynical, John, about the views of domestic politicians? Do they also want us to be divided?
I think your point about Russia is right. I mean, it's interesting. I got contacted yesterday by Russia Today. Will you come on and talk about? You think our country's divided? The country's divided. Come and talk about it. It's not lost on me. I said no. I mean, it's not lost on me that this is the story of the West's failures and the West's inability to solve problems is quite popular in Moscow. and so look, we probably should be positive any change that goes against where Putin would like the country to go. But no, I'm not quite so cynical. I suspect you're not quite so cynical either, Polly. But I think the thing is that a divided society, it depends what you're trying to achieve as a politician. Like if your goal as a politician is you want to win an election and you want to get voted in, and that's your sole goal. Now clearly there's got to be an important goal, because otherwise what's the point? But if that's your sole goal and the divided society gives you a majority, great, great, brilliant. What a way to play. And you can play that game, and you might and the Conservative Party, I think, is benefiting electorally at the moment from some of the divisions. I mean, clearly, if you're Keir Starmer, I would say the divisions are very unhelpful to you electorally at the moment, because you're very activist based on one side of an argument who aren't the majority. But if you're a politician who actually got into politics because you'd like to fix some problems, it's really hard to fix problems when society is so divided, because it's hard to get a real understanding majority of what's required. I mean, I'm about to quote you here, Polly. You wrote something the other day that said, "What is the sign of democracy is not working? It's not how many people go to vote. It's whether we fix problems." I probably paraphrased your point, but I thought it was so wise. Like our democracy is not working because we're not solving problems well. And the problem, I don't think, is that we've got a lack of good leaders. At least I don't think we've got a lack of people who could be great leaders. I think the issue is we don't have great followers. Like, we're so fractured, and we don't understand so many of these problems. We overestimate the number of immigrants in our country by 400%. We overrate the number of Muslims by 1,000%. We overestimate the amount of teenage pregnancy by about 800%. Like, we're not very well informed, and we get really polarized. And so it's quite hard to lead a group of people like that to actually make change happen. So I think if you're a politician who actually would like to solve some problems, I think social division is really difficult.
I'm glad you're not suggesting we just get rid of the voters. It always makes me think of Miss Trunchbull, who said in Matilda, the Roald Dahl, we should just that a school would be much better without any children in it. It would certainly be more ordered. My house would certainly have less stuff on the floor if there weren't any children. So, I mean, it kind of links, I think, to that question of what do the powerful want, and how do you get people for whom the current system works pretty well to adapt, is a question. The name has disappeared, but from someone in Newcastle upon Tyne, people say that they've been forgotten by Westminster elites, but there's also an elite in Newcastle who only look after people like them. I mean, you may have thoughts about Newcastle, but it is that question of how do you get people to change the system if the system works for them by putting them at the top of it.
Yeah. And so my ultimate view that comes across in the book, once you say that we have this bias to people like us, that we naturally tend to be, therefore, fall into silos, it's not that hard to fix if we can spend time together, but we've lost the institutions that do that. Like, my answer is, I think the state has a role to play to actually require us to spend some time with each other. And so, my take is we're always going to have these problems where an in-group forms, it grabs access to power, and we end up with a bad situation. And I think the easiest way to, humans are surprisingly kind and surprisingly empathetic if you can bring them into contact with each other. And so the hard way to do that, people have said to me, why don't you just move to ban all private schools, John? If you're going to be authoritarian, why not do something? But my view is that we can go with the grain here to start with, at least. Like, people, if you say to people, how about a month of community service for children as part of the national curriculum, people kind of go, yeah, that's probably a good idea. Or people say, well, let's not call it parenting classes, let's call it understanding children's brains. Wouldn't that be a good thing and part of a generous childcare offer? I think you get a majority of people saying, that sounds pretty sensible. And how about when you retire, having the chance to really get involved in your community and having some support, some help, maybe with also your financial planning? I think most people go, yeah, that's a pretty good idea too. So I think there are things we can do that actually are pretty popular, would be liked by the people who take part in them, and therefore would sustain, that would just be the start of trying to bring people together. But I think we just haven't even looked at them, because as soon as someone takes the idea of government requiring us and spending time with other people who are strangers, we sort of think, well, only a mad person would put those ideas together. Like
suggesting we talk to people on the tube or something.
No, that is a mad idea. So I think my push is, look, Plymouth is not that different, I suspect, from your description of Newcastle there, but let's start by doing some simple, obvious things to connect each other. But we've got to be prepared to open the door, which is government actually intervening. in the same way that we now all accept income tax, most of us do anyway, which I think is much more a hard moral case to make. The government's going to take money out of my pocket to pay for things I morally disapprove of. They're going to force people out of the country who I think should be in it. They're going to lock people up who I think shouldn't be locked up. They're going to fail to invest in things that I think are really... But we totally accept it. And I think this is a much...
Yeah, it's having our money taken from us is often described by certainly people in the American right as a form of slavery. You have to work and give the proceeds of that work away. And yet the idea of doing something is somehow totally different in terms of its levels of controversy. There's a question here I think is important to just bring in about Singapore, which you cited as a good example, but actually there's also countries in the Middle East that do this as well around importing labour. In Singapore, it's the case of Malaysian labour brought in daily, standing on open trucks, returned at night. It's a form of slavery in a way. And certainly it's a sense, both there's the economic exploitation of outsider workers who don't have status, but it's also, there's an identity exploitation that you can build a sense of cohesion and identity by building a narrative against an outsider group. And that might be through warfare, a sense it might be through religious narratives about the outsiders, whether that's ghastly atheists like me or a religious narrative about outsiders. But that sense of where being British, for example, is about how much outsiders don't belong. And does that worry you really, that the way of building cohesion and identity is actually often built on the backs of enemy style narratives?
Yes, it does. I don't think it helps very much. I mean, it does. I mean, clearly, if you can create one way to create a sense of us is to create a sense of them and a threat. And there's a really interesting study of participants being tricked that aliens are coming, and they become their views around ethnic diversity becomes much more relaxed. That actually, with the introduction of an alien species, suddenly these differences feel less. So there clearly is something about it, but I don't think it's a long-lasting effect, and I think it's quite dangerous for the reasons you lay out. I mean, I'm not here. I'm not paid for by the Singapore government. I'm not here to say everything in Singapore is ideal. Let's be Singapore. I really don't believe that, and I think that some of the ways that they have treated foreign workers that are mentioned are not the way I would want to run a country. I also don't want to run a democracy quite like they run a democracy. So I'm really not here to say Singapore's brilliant, but it's important we understand this. When they were founded, the country happened by accident. It was thrown out of the Malay Federation. It didn't want to be. It didn't have enough land to feed people, and it didn't have enough people to defend itself. And yet the Prime Minister went on TV crying about the biggest problem his country faced. And his primary concern was there were going to be race riots and the country was going to fall apart between the Chinese, the Malay and the Indians. And his primary response was to create a load of institutions that network those people together. And he said, we are not a Chinese nation. We are not an Indian nation. We are not a Malay nation. We are Singapore. And it wasn't about a national story. It was about a set of connections and networks. So I think there are key things about that Singapore set of choices that are worth learning from. At the same time, doesn't mean everything in that country is right, of course.
That's really helpful, thank you. So we're coming to the end of our time, but I just want to finish by mentioning what Jean-Christophe Bas says from Paris, joining, this is an international conference we're having, John. Has your book been translated? Is it going to be translated?
It hasn't been yet, but maybe today we start the demand immediately.
One of my colleagues, Jamie Bartlett, has written several books, and in the office we have the copies of his book in obscure languages. They're not that obscure, but ones that I can't read. So, but he doesn't keep them at home. But it feels like it's a great thing. So anyway, Jean-Christophe says that he's been involved in promoting intercultural dialogue and understanding with the UN, and that we can't leave cohesion just to governments. You need also intermediary organizations. So I guess that's something, I think you and I are pretty aligned on the need for the state to act here. But given that none of us are the Prime Minister, or in fact a minister at all, what could an ordinary person do? or non-state actors? How can we mobilize to build some of these intermediary or cohesive institutions in the interim?
Yeah, so the book ends with 32 things you can do right now, because I basically think there are loads of things individuals can do. I just don't think we can do it by ourselves. But I'll give you 3 very fast ones. So one is, when you leave the event, look on social media, look at the last 10 people who've tweeted to you, and just see if you agree with them on everything. And if you do, add a couple of people that you disagree with to who you follow. I don't mean people that you hate, but like people just have a different point of view. That's one. The second is hospitality. Like once a year, why not invite some neighbours round? It doesn't have to be everyone in your street. I mean, but just pick, 6 people, 10 people.
Once it's legal.
But yes, once you're allowed, sorry. Once the pandemic's over. But pick them on the basis of proximity, not just, I like them, I like them, I like them, I like them. And the third thing is join something. Join a club, join a society, join something for a term. If you hate it, stop going. But these intermediary institutions are really, really valuable. And try and pick one if you can that you don't have to pay very much to go to. Ideally one that's free, because then you're more likely to meet people from different income backgrounds.
Brilliant. Well, we're bang on time. John, thank you very much. And I hope that those who've been listening in, thank you for your brilliant questions. I'm sorry I didn't quite ask them all. Do consider buying John's book. Do please stay connected to Demos as well if you're not on our mailing list or following us on social media. I promise we will occasionally say things you disagree with. So following Demos and all of our team on social media will qualify as a way to meet John's goal. And hopefully we will be able to invite you to real life events in future, again, once they are legal and safe. Thank you so much for joining. Thank you, John, for giving us your time and for writing such a brilliant book.
Thanks for having me, Polly. Real pleasure.